A small, peaceful town nestled in the heart of the Midwest became the backdrop for a scandal that rocked the community to its core. Jessica Miller, a 35-year-old homemaker, had always appeared to have the perfect life. Married to her high school sweetheart Daniel Miller, she seemed to embody the very essence of suburban contentment. But beneath the facade of her seemingly idyllic life lay secrets that would soon unravel in the most tragic of ways. Jessica was known for her striking beauty and charm, which made her the center of attention at social gatherings. Her husband Daniel was a successful real estate agent, well-liked and respected in the community. Together, they had 2 young children and a cozy home that seemed to epitomize the American dream. However, the couple's relationship had grown stale over the years, and Daniel, often preoccupied with work, failed to notice the growing distance between them. Enter Brad Turner, Jessica's cousin's husband. Brad was everything Daniel was not: charismatic, adventurous, and unabashedly flirtatious. He had married Jessica's cousin Amy 5 years ago, and they too had become a regular part of the Millers' social circle. Despite their seemingly perfect marriages, Brad and Jessica shared a chemistry that neither could ignore. Their stolen glances at family gatherings soon turned into secret messages, and before long, a full-blown affair began. The affair between Jessica and Brad was reckless, fueled by passion and danger. They met in secluded motels, exchanged late-night phone calls, and even risked being seen together in public places far from their hometown. It was as if they were daring fate to catch them, addicted to the thrill of secrecy and deception. But as with all secrets, theirs was bound to come to light. Amy, Brad's wife, had long suspected something was amiss. Brad's unexplained absences and late-night phone calls raised her suspicions, but she dismissed them, choosing to believe in her husband's fidelity. However, her intuition nagged at her, and one day, she decided to follow Brad. What she discovered shattered her world. Brad and Jessica locked in a passionate embrace in the parking lot of a remote diner. Amy was devastated, but she didn't confront Brad right away. Instead, she decided to collect evidence, hoping to confront him with undeniable proof. Over the next few weeks, she documented their meetings, took photographs, and even recorded a few of their phone conversations. Armed with this evidence, she finally confronted Brad, who, caught off guard, admitted to the affair. But Amy's confrontation didn't end there. Enraged and humiliated, she decided to confront Jessica as well. The showdown happened in the parking lot of the local grocery store. Witnesses later described the scene as explosive, Amy screaming accusations while Jessica, cornered and panicked, denied everything. The confrontation ended with Amy vowing to expose their affair to the entire family and, more importantly, to Daniel. Terrified by the thought of her husband finding out, Jessica pleaded with Amy for mercy, but it was too late. The damage was done, and the wheels of destruction had been set in motion. Jessica's life, as she knew it, was on the verge of collapse. Feeling trapped and desperate, Jessica reached out to Brad, who was equally frantic. They both knew that once their secret was out, their families would be destroyed. Jessica, in particular, feared losing custody of her children and the comfortable life she had built with Daniel. It was during one of these frantic conversations that Brad, in a moment of desperation, suggested an unthinkable solution, a way to ensure their secret remained buried forever. Jessica recoiled at first, horrified by the suggestion, but as the days passed and the pressure mounted, her resolve began to weaken. She knew that if Amy went through with her threat, she would lose everything. Slowly, a dark plan started to take shape in her mind, a plan that would silence Amy once and for all. Jessica's mind was a whirlwind of fear and panic. The life she had so carefully curated was hanging by a thread, and Amy held the scissors. Every time Jessica saw her husband, Daniel, smiling at her with that trusting, loving gaze, a pang of guilt and terror gripped her heart. She couldn't bear the thought of him finding out the truth. The mere possibility of losing her children was too much to bear. Brad, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frantic. He, too, stood to lose everything: his wife, his family, his reputation. But unlike Jessica, Brad's desperation quickly turned to anger. He blamed Amy for putting them in this position, for threatening to expose their affair and ruin their lives. In his mind, she was the villain, not him, not Jessica. One night, under the cover of darkness, Brad drove to Jessica's house. They sat in her car, parked a few streets away, where no one would recognize them. There, in the suffocating silence, Brad laid out his plan in detail. "We have to get rid of her," he whispered, his voice low and cold. "If she's gone, there's no one left to tell our secret, no one to take our lives away." Jessica shivered at the words. The very idea of hurting someone, let alone her own cousin, made her stomach churn. But as Brad continued, painting a picture of a future without Amy's interference, a future where they could continue their affair without fear of exposure, Jessica found herself considering the unthinkable. It doesn't have to be messy, Brad continued, his eyes intense and unblinking. I've thought it all through. It can look like an accident. No one will ever suspect us. Jessica's head swam with conflicting emotions. Could she really do this? Could she take a life to protect her own secret? But as Brad spoke, as he reassured her that this was the only way, a dark resolve began to form in her mind. She convinced herself that she was doing this not just for herself, but for her children, to protect them from the fallout of her mistakes. Over the next few days, Jessica and Brad meticulously planned Amy's accident. They decided to stage a car crash. Amy often took late-night drives when she couldn't sleep, a habit Jessica knew well. They would tamper with her car's brakes and make it seem like a tragic accident. On the night they decided to carry out their plan, Jessica's hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. She followed Brad to Amy's house, parking a block away. Brad had already scoped out the area and knew the exact time Amy usually left the house. They waited in the darkness, the tension between them palpable. Finally, around midnight, they saw Amy's car pulling out of the driveway. Jessica's heart was pounding so loudly she was sure Brad could hear it. He turned to her, his face a mask of determination. "Now," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Jessica got out of the car, her legs trembling as she moved towards Amy's vehicle. The plan was simple. She would cut the brake line, and then they would leave, knowing that the next time Amy drove, she wouldn't be able to stop. It was supposed to be quick, clean, undetectable. But as Jessica knelt beside the car, the cold metal of the brake line cutter in her hand, something snapped inside her. She couldn't do it. The reality of what she was about to do crashed down on her like a wave, and she started to sob, tears streaming down her face. Brad, seeing her hesitation, rushed over. "What are you doing? We don't have time for this," he hissed, grabbing her arm. I can't do it, Brad," she choked out, her voice broken. "This is wrong. We can't kill her." But Brad was beyond reason. His eyes flashed with anger, and he yanked the cutter from her hand. "If you're not going to do it, I will," he snapped. Jessica watched in horror as Brad leaned under the car and with a quick, vicious movement severed the brake line. He stood up, his face twisted with a mix of fury and triumph. "There, it's done. Now let's go." They rushed back to their car, Jessica's mind reeling. What had they done? As they sped away, she looked back at Amy's house, her heart breaking with guilt and fear. But it was too late now. The deed was done. They barely spoke on the drive back, the silence between them heavy and oppressive. Jessica dropped Brad off a few blocks from his house, watching as he disappeared into the night. She drove home in a daze, her mind numb. She barely remembered parking the car and stumbling into her house. She spent the rest of the night in a haze of fear and regret, staring blankly at the ceiling as the hours ticked by. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Amy's face, heard her laughter, and felt a fresh wave of horror wash over her. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the image of Brad, his face cold and determined as he cut the brake line. Morning came, and with it, a sense of impending doom. Jessica jumped at every sound, her heart racing every time the phone rang. And then, just after noon, the news she had been dreading arrived. Amy was dead. Amy's death, initially ruled a tragic accident, sent shockwaves through the small town. A car crash on a lonely stretch of road, with no one around to witness it, seemed like an unfortunate but believable end. The authorities had no reason to suspect foul play at first. To everyone who knew Amy, it was a heartbreaking loss, except for two people. Jessica's life had become a nightmare. She couldn't shake the gnawing guilt that consumed her day and night. Even though Brad had carried out the plan, she felt equally complicit in Amy's death. Every time she saw Daniel's face or heard her children laugh, a fresh wave of shame washed over her. The sense of impending doom never left her. Brad, on the other hand, appeared to have moved on. He acted as though nothing had happened, going about his daily life without a hint of remorse. His confidence in their plan's success, in its accidental nature, unnerved Jessica. She couldn't understand how he could be so cold. Worse, Brad continued to call her, urging her to stay calm and reminding her that this was the only way to protect their secret. But Jessica couldn't stay calm. She was unraveling. The police, initially satisfied with their conclusion of accidental death, conducted a routine investigation into the accident. But soon, small inconsistencies began to emerge. A seasoned detective, Detective Karen, noticed that the brake failure in Amy's car wasn't as simple as it appeared. The car had been well maintained maintained, and there were no signs of mechanical wear that could explain the malfunction. What if it wasn't an accident? Willis murmured to herself as she went over the case files. Something about it didn't sit right with her. The lack of skid marks, the sudden failure of the brakes, and Amy's history of cautious driving raised more questions than answers. She decided to dig deeper. Her suspicions were further aroused when she spoke to Amy's close friends and family, including her devastated cousin, Jessica. Though Jessica appeared grief-stricken, Willis noticed a peculiar tension in her demeanor. It wasn't just sadness, it was something else, something that made Willis pause. She filed it away in her mind, intending to revisit Jessica's involvement later. The turning point came when a local mechanic examined the car more closely. His report was shocking. The brake line had been deliberately cut. Willis's instincts were right. This wasn't an accident. It was murder. With this new information, the investigation took a sharp turn. The police began looking into Amy's personal life, her relationships, and anyone who might have had a motive to kill her. Naturally, her husband, Brad, became a person of interest. When questioned, Brad played the part of the grieving husband perfectly. He expressed shock, sadness, and anger at the idea that someone might have murdered his wife. He even suggested that maybe Amy had enemies in her workplace or had been the victim of a random attack. But Willis wasn't convinced. Something about Brad didn't add up, and she began to dig deeper into his life. What she found confirmed her suspicions. Brad had been having an affair with none other than Jessica Miller. The affair had been well hidden, but not hidden enough. Hotel receipts, text messages, and phone records all pointed to a long-term relationship between Brad and Jessica. The police now had not only a motive for Amy's murder, but two key suspects. Jessica, too, was brought in for questioning. By the time Jessica sat in the interrogation room across from Detective Willis, she was a shell of the confident, charming woman she once was. The guilt and fear had taken their toll. Her hands trembled as she tried to maintain composure, but it was clear that she was on the edge. "Jessica," Willis began, her voice calm but firm, "I know you've been through a lot lately. I know this is hard for you, but we've found some things that don't quite add up. Your cousin's death wasn't an accident." Jessica's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't breathe. She had known this day would come, but now that it was here, it was worse than she'd ever imagined. Her brake line was cut, Willis continued, her eyes fixed on Jessica. This wasn't a random malfunction. Someone tampered with her car. Jessica felt the room spinning. She could hear her pulse pounding in her ears. Willis kept talking, her words blurring together in Jessica's mind. Brad's name was mentioned, the affair, the investigation. Jessica knew what came next. They were closing in, and she had no way out. I didn't want to," Jessica began, her voice barely a whisper. Willis leaned forward. "You didn't want to what, Jessica?" Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the weight of the secret, the guilt, the fear of losing everything. It was too much to bear. She was on the verge of breaking, but before she could speak, the door to the interrogation room swung open. Detective Willis turned to see who had entered. It was another officer holding a piece of paper in his hand. He handed it to Willis, who scanned it quickly. A slow smile spread across her face as she turned back to Jessica. "We have enough evidence now, Jessica. Brad's fingerprints were found on the brake line. It's over." Jessica's world collapsed. She had wanted to protect herself, her family, her secret, but now it was all unraveling. She wasn't sure if she should feel relief or terror. Brad was caught, and with him, so was she. Jessica sat in her cell, staring blankly at the cold gray walls. It had only been a few days since her arrest, but it felt like an eternity. She had finally confessed everything: the affair, the plan to kill Amy, and how it all spiraled out of control. Brad had been arrested too, his arrogance shattered when confronted with the overwhelming evidence. The trial was swift and merciless. The prosecutor painted a damning picture of a woman driven by greed and desperation, manipulated by her lover into committing a heinous act. Brad, in a last-ditch effort to save himself, tried to place all the blame on Jessica, portraying her as the mastermind behind the murder, but the jury saw through his lies. Jessica, overwhelmed by guilt and remorse, pled guilty to her role in the crime. She admitted to her mistakes, her affair, and her part in the plan, but insisted she never wanted Amy dead. It was too little, too late. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. Brad received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His cold, calculated actions and lack of remorse convinced the court that he was the true villain in this tragic story. As Jessica sat in the courtroom, listening to her fate being sealed, she realized how far she had fallen. She had once had everything: a loving family, a stable life, but she had thrown it all away for a man who had led her down a path of destruction. The faces of her children flashed before her eyes eyes and a sob escaped her lips. This was her punishment, not just the prison sentence, but the knowledge that she had destroyed her own life and the lives of those she loved. The scandal rocked the town for years to come, a cautionary tale of how love, betrayal, and desperation can lead to unimaginable consequences. For Jessica, there would be no redemption, only the cold comfort of knowing that she would never see Brad again.